This move, the king's pawn opening, immediately claims central space and opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, setting the stage for aggressive central play and rapid development. This move symmetrically contests the center, immediately creating a pawn duel and opening lines for bishops and queens, setting the stage for classic open game theory. This move develops a knight towards the center, attacking black's e5 pawn and preparing for kingside castling, a fundamental principle in opening play. Developing the knight to c6 is a natural and principled move, controlling the central d4 square and preparing for further development, commonly leading to the queen's pawn game or various open games. This move initiates the Ruy-Lopez opening, a foundational classical opening, by developing the bishop to a square where it attacks the knight on c6, indirectly pressuring black's e5 pawn and aiming for long-term positional advantages by potentially exchanging the bishop for black's knight. This move, the Morphy defense, directly challenges white's bishop, forcing it to either retreat or capture, and gains space on the queenside which may be used to launch a counterattack later. This move, Ba4, maintains pressure on black's knight and preserves the bishop's influence on the long diagonal, a key feature of the Ruy-Lopez opening. This move, 4, nf6, is a common and principled response in the Ruy-Lopez, directly challenging white's central pawn and developing a piece aggressively. Castling kingside secures the king and prepares to connect the rooks, a fundamental developmental goal after opening principles are met. Developing the bishop to e7 is a standard move in the Ruy-Lopez, reinforcing the knight on f6 and preparing to castle kingside, a crucial step in securing the king and connecting the rooks. This move repositions the rook to the central file, preparing to support a central pawn push or reinforce the kingside, a common theme in this Ruy-Lopez variation. This move challenges the bishop, forcing it to retreat and gaining space on the queenside while preparing to develop the queenside pieces. The bishop retreats to b-3, maintaining the pin on the c6 knight and preparing to defend the e4 pawn while keeping pressure along the long diagonal. This move solidifies the pawn center and prepares to develop the queen's bishop, typical of many Ruy-Lopez structures. This move solidifies white's central pawn structure and prepares to support the d4 advance, aiming to gain more space and control in the center of the board. Black castles kingside, completing an essential development step and securing the king while bringing a rook closer to the center of the board. This move is a prophylactic measure to prevent black from potentially playing bg4, which would pin the nf3, thus interfering with white's central pawn push and king's knight development. This move abandons the central light squares and develops the knight to a passive square, indicating a potential defensive setup that aims to solidify the pawn structure while allowing white to gain space and initiative. This move decisively challenges the center, aiming to open lines for white's pieces and create tactical possibilities while black's knight has retreated from its active square. This move, NBD7, is a common maneuver in the Ruy-Lopez, aiming to reroute the knight via f8 to the more active g6 square, preparing to challenge white's central pawn advances and often supporting a queenside expansion. With c5, this move prepares to redeploy the knight to f1 and then to g3, aiming to participate in an eventual kingside attack or to support the central advance. This move develops the bishop to its most active diagonal, putting pressure on white's queenside and preparing to challenge control of the central dark squares. This repositioning of the bishop to c2 supports the central pawn push d4 and prepares to contest the c-file. a common strategic goal in this Ruy-Lopez variation. This move reinforces the e-file and prepares to contest the central tension, potentially supporting a d5 pawn push later in the game. This knight maneuver prepares to reroute the knight to a more active central square, likely f3, after potentially developing the kingside pawn structure and increasing kingside pressure. This move repositions the bishop to a more passive square, aiming to prepare for the eventual advance of the d-pawn and potentially support a kingside pawn push later in the game. The knight repositions to g3, aiming to support the f5 square and potentially join an attack on the kingside, a common strategic maneuver in the Ruy-Lopez closed variation. This pawn move prepares to fianchetto the bishop to g7, aiming to control the long diagonal and support a central pawn push in the future. This move is a strong positional pawn break designed to challenge black's queenside pawn majority and potentially create an open file for white's rook. This move initiates a bold central pawn break, challenging white's space advantage and opening lines for black's pieces, aiming to equalize the position by creating dynamic counterplay. This move solidifies white's central pawn mass, aiming to restrict black's queenside expansion and prepare for a potential kingside attack by creating a strong pawn chain and controlling key squares. The knight's relocation to b6 aims to contest white's queenside space advantage gained by a4 and prepare the advance of the c-pawn. This move prepares to develop the queen to a more active square, potentially supporting a kingside attack or challenging black's central control. Black captures the advanced pawn, disrupting white's queenside space advantage and potentially opening lines for counterplay, though it concedes control of the d5 square. White correctly exchanges the bishop for the knight, simplifying the position and opening the a-file for potential future activity, while black now has to deal with the consequences of the pawn structure created by a6 and b5. Black captures the pawn, opening the b-file for their rook and disrupting white's queenside pawn structure in exchange for the advanced a-pawn. This captures the pawn, but opens the a-file for black's rook, potentially leading to pressure on white's queenside infrastructure. Black retreats the bishop to c8 to prepare for a likely c4 push, aiming to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and gain space on that wing. This move aims to prevent black from consolidating their queenside pawn majority and potentially supports a future advance of the queenside pawns or a central pawn push. This move repositions the rook to a more active square, eyeing the weak b-pawn and potentially supporting a future advance on the queenside. White's rook maneuver to a3 aims to reposition the piece to a more active file, potentially supporting a kingside attack or challenging black's pawn structure. This move repositions the rook from the now closed c-file to the e-file, aiming to support a potential e5 pawn push and potentially contest the open file if black's d-pawn advances. This move solidifies white's pawn center and prepares to contest the d-file, potentially leading to a more closed position that benefits white's queenside maneuvering. This move strategically repositions the rook to reinforce the queenside pawn structure and prepares to contest the semi-open c-file. This move prepares to centralize the queen and potentially support a kingside pawn push, while also keeping an eye on potential weaknesses in black's queenside pawn structure. This move begins a repositioning maneuver for the knight, aiming to centralize it on f6 and potentially support a kingside attack or reinforce the center if white's queenside pressure intensifies. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to pressure black's queenside pawns and potentially support a kingside initiative. This move is part of Black's plan to reposition the knight from its somewhat passive g7 square to a more active central square, likely targeting the d6 and e5 squares while preparing to support a pawn push. This knight maneuver aims to redeploy to a more active central square, potentially f1 or g4, after white's pawn structure has been somewhat compromised and the queenside has been opened. This pawn thrust seeks to break open the kingside and potentially create attacking chances by exploiting the weakened dark squares, though it also weakens white's central pawn control. This move prepares to contest the crucial open b-file, aiming to activate the rook and potentially create play against Black's queenside pawns. Black initiates a crucial pawn break with 26, rf7, aiming to challenge white's centralized pawn structure and open lines for counterplay on the kingside and central files. This pawn break on b4 aims to challenge white's queenside pawn structure and open lines for Black's pieces, particularly the rook on b8, creating counterplay against white's extended pawn chain. This move sacrifices a pawn to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and open lines for Black's pieces, aiming for active counterplay on the queenside and center. This recapture on b4 is strategically sound, aiming to simplify the position after Black's pawn sacrifice and maintain an active piece structure. This move activates the rook to the 7th rank, creating immediate pressure on white's queenside pawns and preparing to potentially contest the open b-file. This move repositions the rook to a more active square, eyeing the potentially weak b-pawn and preparing for further pressure along the 3rd rank. The move 29, qb6 seeks to contest the open b-file and potentially create threats against white's queenside pawns. This move repositions the rook to a more active square, supporting the pawn advance on the queenside and preparing for potential pawn breaks or piece activity along the 3rd rank. This pawn advance on the queenside aims to challenge white's rook on a3 and potentially gain space. But it also weakens the queenside pawn structure, creating targets for white's pieces. This move aims to challenge Black's queenside pawn majority and potentially create weaknesses by forcing exchanges on the queenside. The move qd4 offers a tactical exchange that simplifies the position and aims to activate the queen, potentially targeting white's weakened kingside pawns. White simplifies the position by exchanging queenside pieces, aiming to exploit the open b-file for their rook after the trade. This exchange on the queenside liberates the rook from its defensive task, allowing it to seek active play on the open files or potentially support a kingside advance. This move aims to centralize the rook, open lines for potential counterplay on the d-file, and prepare for further pawn advances or piece maneuvering. This move aims to centralize the queen and potentially pressure white's queenside pawn structure, while also preparing for further maneuvers like a4 or defending against potential threats along the c-file. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to control central squares and potentially support pawn breaks or king attacks later in the game. This move activates the queen to the queenside, aiming to challenge white's control of the a-file and potentially create attacking opportunities on the queenside or in the center. This move repositions the queen to a more active central square, eyeing potential tactics along the central files and supporting the pawn on c4. The knight on a4 is now exposed, and Black seeks to exploit white's weakened queenside pawn structure by threatening a discovered attack on the c2 queen and potentially launching an attack on the d3 rook. This move prepares to centralize the rook, potentially supporting a push on the d-file or reinforcing the kingside defense. while also freeing the d3 square for other pieces. This move strategically repositions the rook to a more active file, aiming to exert pressure on white's queenside and potentially support central pawn breaks or infiltration. This move prepares to reinforce the d-pawn and potentially open lines on the c-file, aiming to counter black's queenside pressure and prepare a central break. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing the f1 square and potentially preparing to challenge white's control of the c-file. This move aims to reposition the knight to a more active square on f3, potentially supporting a central pawn push or preparing to contest the d-file. This pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's control of the center and potentially open lines for black's pieces, especially the queen and bishop on a6. This move aims to reposition the knight to a more active square, potentially supporting a kingside attack or defending against black's pawn advances, while also freeing up the g2 square for potential further development. This move correctly prepares to challenge white's advanced knight and central pawn structure, aiming to activate black's pieces for future counterplay. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing the d4 pawn and preparing for potential knight transfers or support for pawn breaks later. This move activates the knight, preparing to contest the important central squares and potentially support a kingside pawn advance, like f4, while also unblocking the g7 knight's potential diagonal for future defensive or attacking maneuvers. This move prepares to activate the rook on the vulnerable queenside pawn structure, aiming to challenge black's control of the a-file. This move, qb4, is a tactical repositioning that challenges white's rook on a3 and also prepares to potentially exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure if the rook retreats. This move aims to challenge black's control of the queenside and improve the bishop's position by redeploying it to a more active diagonal after the pawn exchange. This move initiates a sharp tactical sequence by black, aiming to exploit white's slightly uncoordinated pieces and potentially create counterplay by opening lines around white's king. This move is a critical capture that initiates a tactical exchange, aiming to simplify the position and potentially disrupt black's control of the d-file, though it also opens lines for black's rook. This move is a critical blunder, allowing white to win material by exploiting the undefended rook on c7. This move aims to redeploy the knight to a more active central square, preparing to support potential pawn advances or contest key central squares. The move 44, k2, is a desperate attempt to create counterplay by attacking the weak pawns on the kingside and potentially forcing a draw through perpetual check, but it overlooks white's strong central control and the protected passed pawn. This move recaptures the pawn, aiming to simplify the position and reduce black's attacking potential, though it allows black's queen to penetrate further into white's territory. This move prepares to sacrifice the bishop on d3 to open lines and activate the queenside pawns, aiming for counterplay against white's overextended king. This move aims to centralize the bishop and potentially contest the weakened light squares on black's queenside. This captures the pawn and simplifies the position, removing an active defender from white's queenside and creating a passed pawn for black. This recapture on e4 opens the d-file, potentially activating white's rook and forcing black to defend its advanced queenside pawns, which are now vulnerable. The knight captures the advanced pawn, challenging white's rook and centralizing the knight into a more active square. This move consolidates the bishop's position, offering improved defense for the king and preparing to possibly support a kingside pawn advance. The knight repositions to c5, aiming to disrupt white's rook control on the a file and potentially create counterplay by attacking the d3 pawn. The move 49. qd2 repositions the queen to a central, active square, preparing to contest the open c file and potentially support further pawn advances or coordinate with the rook on the third rank. This move brings the queen back to a central square, eyeing white's compromised kingside and potentially preparing for further pressure on the d file or even a central pawn push. The rook moves to the 7th rank, aiming to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and potentially create passed pawns or attack weak squares like b7. This move allows the black queen to centralize and support potential pawn pushes, while also preparing for a defensive retreat if white's rook becomes too active on the 7th rank. This move activates the queen to a powerful central square, threatening the weak pawn on c5 and preparing to exploit the open lines created by the recent exchanges. The pawn move g5 attempts to create a defensive shield for the black king and simultaneously prepares to launch a counterattack on the kingside, aiming to exploit the potentially overextended white pieces. This move aims to protect the advanced and potentially dangerous passed pawn on a5, while also preparing to activate the bishop on the queenside.